In this video, we're going to be going over using ratios to problem solve. In addition, we'll be talking about problem solving problems that have fractions in there, and if you want to continue to solve it in fractions or convert to decimals. For these types of problems, you're going to need to be able to figure out the steps you need to take to hit that end target. This first problem is an example of that. If it takes 6 hours to paint 5/7 of a truck, how long will it take to paint the whole truck? Now this is a ratio. We have in 6 hours, 5/7 of the truck. First of all, in this type of problem solving, oftentimes students are more comfortable converting everything to decimals. Well, 5/7 is a pretty messy decimal, so I'm first going to show how to solve this type of problem if we kept it in fractions. The first thing to understand is what 5/7 means. And if we think of this as being kind of a unit bar, and this whole thing is the truck. 5/7 is saying we're taking that truck and we're dividing it into 7 parts. In 6 hours' time, we are able to paint 5/7 of the truck, and 5/7 would look like this. It's 5 parts, 3, 4, 5, and in that time, it takes 6 hours, and we're able to complete 5/7 of the truck. Now to represent, and we need to find out, okay, what's going to be the total time so that we can finish or get to 7/7, which is the whole truck. We can set up this information using a table and looking at hours, and I'm just going to call this truck. In 6 hours, we're able to complete 5/7 of the truck. Now 5/7 can be a little bit uncomfortable for people to work with, and people might often want to say, oh, I want to change this 5/7 into a decimal. What is, well, 5/7, this means 5 divided by 7. So all you're doing when you change it into a decimal is you're just keeping it in a perfect ratio, but you're getting that denominator to 1. We don't need to do that. We can call 5/7 or 5 divided by 7 5/7 instead of getting it to this decimal form so that we can ignore the denominator. And I'm going to use a calculator and just show this. 5 divided by 7, if you got it to a decimal, is 0.714286. That's kind of a messy number to work with, especially when we consider that next step. Because in 6 hours, we're saying then he's able to do 0.714286 of the truck. How are you going to use that to figure out how long it takes him to get to the whole truck? I can show that at the end, but for this part, I'm just going to focus on this fraction understanding because it will make solving the problem much nicer. So right now, if I know it takes him 5/7 to do 6 hours, my next move is going to be to figure out how long does it take him to do 1/7. Because if I know 5/7, it's hard for me to get from 5/7 to 7/7, which is the whole truck. So I'm going to go from this 5/7 to just 1/7. So if I have 5 parts and I'm moving to 1 part, I'm dividing by 5. 5/7 divided by 5 will give me 1/7. That's what that part is shaded in black. So whatever I do to one side, I must do to the rest. So I'm going to divide 6 hours by 5. Once again, you don't need to convert this into a decimal. 6 divided by 5 is 6/5. If that makes you uncomfortable, you can also think about it as, well, 5/5 would be a whole, so it's like 1 and 1/5. As a decimal, if you really wanted to, you can see, yeah, 1 and 1/5 is 1.2. 1/5 is 2/10. But I'm not going to get into that decimal work right now. I want to stay as that fraction. So in 6/5 hours, or 1 and 1/5 of an hour, 1.2 hours, he can paint 1/7 of the truck. Now we want to figure out for the whole truck. Now we have 1/7. Now we can multiply to get to the whole truck. Multiply by 7. And what does that give me? 7/7, which equals 1 whole. Whatever I do to one side, I must do to the rest. So now I'm going to do 6/5 times 7. And how do we do that? 6/5. Now this is where I've mentioned many times, every number is a fraction, every number is a decimal, every number is a ratio to something. Well, 6/5 times 7, which 7 is 7 over 1. 7 once. Go across 42 fifths. So it takes him 42 fifths hours to paint the whole truck. In this type of problem, we don't want to leave that as our final answer, especially if I'm asking hours and minutes. 42 fifths, remember, 5/5 is a whole. So how many times does 5 go into 42? How many wholes do we get? Well, that equals 8. And we would have 2/5 remaining. So our final answer could be 8 2/5 hours to paint the whole truck. But once again, for many problems, I might ask hours and minutes. So 8 2/5 hours equals, well, how many minutes? Well, you would need to know, okay, there's 60 minutes, so 1/5 of an hour is 12 minutes. So we're talking about 2/5, so that's 8 hours, 24 minutes. And that would be the final answer for this problem. If you are solving it with decimals, and once again, that's such a difficult path to go, but you would go from hours, truck, 6 hours to 0.714286, and you would figure out we need to get the whole truck. How do I get from 0.714286 to that whole truck? Once again, I'll pull out the calculator. So you'd think, okay, what do I need to multiply? So I would do 1 divided by 0.714, and you'd probably round it off. Well, it would be multiplied by times like 1.4. Switch to black. Times 1.4. So I would multiply 6 times 1.4 as well. And 6 times 1.4, I'll just leave it in here and do times 6. And that equals about 8.4 hours, which is the same thing. So you're talking about 4/10 of an hour, which is the same thing as 2/5. So you need to figure out what that means in terms of minutes. So you could use a table to solve it as well. You need to be pretty good with your division in order to do that. To go straight from decimals. This next type of problem, if J reads 1 1/8 pages per minute, how many pages does J read in an hour? I'll set this up using a table. We can use fractions and decimals. I'm going to do one with fractions, and I'll do one with decimals. They both keep a consistent ratio. Pages, minutes, so he reads 1 1/8. I'm also going to represent that as 9/8. 1 whole, remember, it's 8/8, so we would have 9/8. So 8/8 and 1/8 would be 9/8. And per minute, how many does he read in an hour? An hour now is 60 minutes, so you're multiplying by 60. Whatever you do to one side, you must do to the rest. So 9/8 times 60. If you were solving it over here with decimals, once again, we'd have pages, minutes. But instead of 9/8, we would represent that 1 1/8 as a decimal. So you'd figure out, okay, well, we know the 1, that stays 1 whole. 1/8, what would that be as a decimal? So you'd have to do 1 divided by 8. And if you're using a calculator, or not using a calculator, but I'm going to do that to save time in the video, it's 1.125. So it takes him, so he can read 1.125 pages per 1 minute, and now we multiply by 60 to get to the target. You want to be versatile to be able to do it with fractions or decimals. So 1.125 times 60, if you're doing it like this, 1.125 times 60, he would read 67.5 pages in 60 minutes. If you're doing with fractions, you would do 9/8 times 60, and remember 60 over 1, that would be 540 eighths. And then you would have to divide that out, 540 divided by 8. $67.5, or in this case, I'm sorry, it would be 6, and you would have, 48, 14 minus 76. You'd have 6 remaining, and this down, 7, now we'd have 56. And you would leave this in terms of a fraction, so you would have 4 remaining. We wouldn't even need to turn that into a decimal, so it would be 67 4/8, or 67 1/2, if you were doing this side. Because that remainder of 4, we wouldn't write R4, we would just say there's 4 out of 8 remaining. We wouldn't need to turn it into a decimal. If we were doing the same thing, if he reads 1 1/8 pages per minute, so I'm going to call this 9/8 in 1 minute. How long does it take him to read 72 pages? So this is where it gets quite difficult to get this to 72 pages. See, I know we just start multiplying to go from 9/8 to 72/8. This is an example where I might be more comfortable solving this in decimals, and knowing that 9/8, remember, was 1 1/8, 1.125, because you could do 9 divided by 8 too, 1.125 in 1 minute. How do I get to 72? You would need to think, what am I multiplying by? So you can do fact families, do 72 divided by 1.125, and you're multiplying by 64. So it'd be 64 minutes. On this side, you would need to think about, okay, to go from 9/8 from 1 1/8 to get to 72, what are you multiplying by? And that would be 64 as well. But I think that this one might be an example where it might be easier to see in terms of decimals. So we have 9/8. We're multiplying by, to go from 9 to 72, be 72 first. But I'm not going to get into this one. I'll go over this example more in class. It's a little bit harder to see.